The Great Maple Syrup Heist Part 1. The Discovery. On an August morning in 2012, the warehouse near St. Louis de Blandford should have felt as solid and predictable as ever. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust motes hung suspended in the thin shafts of light that filtered through high industrial windows. Rows of identical white metal barrels stretched into the dim distance, stacked in columns that climbed toward the corrugated ceiling like some strange industrial forest. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of settling metal and the distant hum of rural Quebec beyond the walls. Each barrel was supposed to be a unit of security, a promise, part of a carefully calculated reserve meant to protect Quebec's maple syrup industry from bad seasons and volatile markets. Together, they represented one of the strangest fortunes in the world. Tens of thousands of drums holding more than enough syrup to influence global prices. This was not simply storage. This was power measured in barrels. The inspector who entered that day was used to the quiet. He had made this walk before, many times. The reserve was not a bustling factory floor but a storage vault, a place where time seemed to slow around steel, dust, and the faint sweet smell that seeped from the seams of the barrels. That smell was always there, lingering like a memory. Maple, rich and dark and unmistakable, clung to everything. Inspections were periodic but routine. The barrels were counted, paperwork was reconciled, and spot checks were performed to confirm that the Federation's strategic reserve, its bank of maple syrup, was intact. The inspector had no reason to suspect that this visit would be any different. He carried his clipboard. He checked his marks. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned not to question what was already understood. He moved along the aisles, checking marks and positions, tracing the coded logic of the inventory system. Numbers matched, labels aligned. Everything appeared correct on paper. To reach a higher row for a closer inspection, he began to climb the stacked barrels as he had done before. A full barrel of maple syrup is unbelievably heavy. 600 pounds of dense, amber liquid packed into steel. When filled, such barrels are almost immovable, solid, stable, anchored by sheer mass. Underfoot, they normally felt like stone. Reliable, unshakable. But as he stepped onto one near the top of a stack, the steel shifted beneath him. The barrel wobbled, unexpectedly, threatening to roll. And for a split second, the inspector felt himself losing balance. That moment of imbalance was the first sign that something was wrong. A full syrup barrel did not move like that. Couldn't move like that. Catching himself with one hand against the stack, he felt again, pressing his weight down carefully, testing. The barrel seemed too light. Far too light. Not anchored by the familiar, almost geological mass he instinctively expected. A creeping unease replaced the muscle memory of countless safe climbs. He climbed down slowly, heart beating faster now, and returned with the tools to open the barrel. The seal gave way with a soft hiss. Lifting the heavy metal lid, he looked inside. He did not see the glossy, dark surface of syrup. Instead, the liquid inside looked thin, clear, wrong. He stared at it for a long moment, not quite believing what his eyes were telling him. Then he touched it, brought his fingers to his lips. Water. It was water. One barrel filled with water could have been a bizarre mistake. An isolated act of sabotage. Some strange accident in handling or storage. But the inspector knew the logic of the reserve, and he understood what he was looking at. This was not a backroom drum in a small sugar shack. This was one of thousands of barrels held in trust for the entire province's producers. Part of a system designed to stabilize an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The presence of water where syrup should have been was a crack in the foundation. It demanded an answer. The alarm spread quickly within the Fédération de producteurs acéricoles du Québec. Phone calls were made. Voices grew tense. The Federation's strategic reserve existed precisely because maple syrup was too valuable, too central to Quebec's rural economy, to be left entirely to the whims of weather and harvest cycles. Good years produced more syrup than the market could absorb at a stable price. The surplus went into these warehouses, stored for years if necessary. In lean years, the Federation could release barrels, smoothing out supply and keeping prices from spiking. It was, in effect, a central bank for syrup. And now, at least one unit of its currency had turned out to be counterfeit. Inspectors began sampling more barrels. They moved through the aisles with new urgency, testing weights, tapping steel, listening for the telltale hollow ring of an empty drum. Some barrels seemed lighter than they should. Others, when opened, revealed contents that sloshed too easily, without the slow, thick, resistant movement of real syrup. Tests showed dilution, substitution, deception on a scale no one had imagined possible. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, spot checks turned into a systematic sweep, row after row, stack after stack, and the initial suspicion hardened into a horrifying realization. The problem was not a single barrel, not a single stack. Large sections of the reserve had been compromised. The numbers told a story almost too large to grasp. The warehouse contained thousands upon thousands of barrels, each one representing a significant sum of money once filled with syrup. The strategic reserve across Quebec held an even larger total, tens of thousands of drums that, at prevailing prices, translated into tens of millions of dollars in stored value. In this warehouse alone, a vast fraction of that value had quietly vanished. Some barrels were empty, completely drained, their interiors dry and echoing. Others were partially drained, just enough missing that the weight difference might go unnoticed during a casual check. Still others contained only water, carefully poured in to conceal the weight loss at a glance. Someone had thought this through. Someone had been methodical. The idea that such a theft could occur seemed at first almost ridiculous. Maple syrup was not gold bullion, not cash, not high-end electronics or artwork or any of the traditional targets of large-scale theft. It was a breakfast condiment, a regional specialty, something that came in small glass bottles at diners and gift shops. Yet the reality of the situation was harsher and more complex. In Quebec, syrup functioned very much like a high-value commodity, traded, stored, regulated. And the reserve had concentrated that value in one place, in one vulnerable format. Each barrel could be worth more than $1,000. Multiply that by thousands of barrels, and this one facility was storing a fortune comparable to that of a bank vault. Only with far fewer protections. No armed guards. No cameras. No alarms. Just barrels. And trust. As the inspection figures were tallied and matched against the Federation's records, the scope of the crime began to crystallize. Investigators would eventually estimate that nearly 9,571 barrels had been affected, representing close to 3,000 metric tons of maple syrup, with a value around 18 to 19 million Canadian dollars at the time. Enough syrup to fill several Olympic-sized swimming pools. Enough value to fund entire towns. Enough weight to require industrial logistics. But on that first day, the men and women walking the aisles did not yet have the final total. They had only an expanding pattern of absence. Barrels that weighed too little, that rang hollow when tapped, that gave way underfoot when they should have stood firm. The warehouse felt different now. Where there had been the reassuring sense of stored abundance, of safety, of preparation, there was suddenly a sense of violation. The strategic reserve was built on trust. Trust in the Federation's oversight. Trust in the integrity of the supply chain. Trust that the syrup painstakingly produced each spring and consigned to those white barrels would remain there, untouched, until the industry needed it. Someone had exploited that trust on a staggering scale. The inspector's near fall from a wobbling barrel had exposed a hollow that ran deep into the heart of Quebec's maple economy. Outside the warehouse walls, producers and buyers still assumed that the reserve stood behind the industry, ready to buffer a bad season, ready to absorb a surplus. Business continued as normal. Markets operated on the belief that Quebec's syrup stockpile was secure. Inside, among the stacks of compromised barrels, the people on the ground knew that assumption was no longer safe. What the Federation believed to be a stable stockpile of liquid security had been quietly turned into a crime scene. The discovery in 2012 of that one light, treacherous barrel was the moment the great maple syrup heist stopped being an invisible operation and became a crisis that would ripple across Quebec, Canada, and eventually the world. But to understand how this happened, how someone could drain nearly 3,000 metric tons of syrup from under the noses of an entire industry, you first need to understand what makes Quebec's maple syrup so valuable in the first place, and why so much power was concentrated in so few hands. Part 2: The system. By the early 2010s, Quebec was not just another maple syrup producing region. It was the center of the maple world. Close to 2/3 of all the maple syrup on the planet flowed from its sugar bushes each spring, collected in a brief, weather-dependent season when daytime thaws and nighttime freezes coaxed sap out of maple trees. It was a delicate dance with nature. Too warm and the sap wouldn't flow. Too cold and the trees stayed dormant. The window was narrow, unpredictable, and absolutely critical. Producers spent long hours in those weeks, sometimes around the clock, boiling that thin, clear sap down into dense amber syrup. It took roughly 40 gallons of sap to produce a single gallon of finished syrup. The process was labor-intensive, fuel-hungry, and required both skill and patience. They were turning an unpredictable natural bounty into something concentrated, storable, and highly valuable. In that context, the question of who controlled the flow of syrup, and on what terms, became central to the province's rural economy. And the answer to that question was very clear. At the heart of that control stood the Fédération de producteurs acéricoles du Québec, the Maple Producers Federation. It did not merely represent producers. It organized them. It structured the entire legal framework through which most commercial syrup moved in the province. Producers under its system were assigned quotas, hard limits on how much they could sell into the regulated market. The Federation negotiated bulk prices with buyers. It controlled access. It determined supply. In practice, this meant the Federation could influence how much syrup was released to the market and at what price, smoothing out the swings that would otherwise result when a bumper crop followed a poor season, or when global demand unexpectedly rose or fell. To supporters, this system was essential. It protected small producers from ruinous price crashes. It gave the industry stability and leverage. Without it, they argued, Quebec's maple producers would be at the mercy of volatile markets and powerful buyers who could drive prices into the ground. To critics, it looked like something else entirely. The strategic reserve grew out of this philosophy of managed supply. Rather than letting a big harvest flood the market and send prices tumbling, the Federation bought and stored surplus syrup in large warehouses, often in rural areas like those around St. Louis de Blandford, where land was cheap and scrutiny was minimal. Thousands of white, unmarked metal barrels were filled and stacked in neat rows, each one holding hundreds of pounds of syrup. In good years, more barrels were added to the reserve. In bad years, when a warm winter or poor sap flow cut production, the Federation could release barrels back into the market to keep buyers supplied and prices from spiking. Conceptually, it functioned like a buffer stock, a commodity reserve, a kind of maple central bank, whose assets just happened to be sweet and sticky. The barrels themselves were treated as standardized units of value. Each barrel was inspected when it entered the reserve, graded for quality, and recorded in the Federation's inventory system. Once inside, though, they became anonymous soldiers in a larger army of supply. Identical white drums stacked 3, 4, or more high, filling cool, cavernous warehouses. The strategic reserve reached into the tens of thousands of barrels across multiple sites, representing syrup worth tens, or even hundreds, of millions of dollars at prevailing prices. The system assumed that once a barrel crossed the threshold into the reserve, it was as safe and reliable as a number on a bank's balance sheet. It assumed trust. It assumed compliance. It assumed no one would be bold enough or desperate enough to challenge it. But while the Federation saw itself as a stabilizing force, not everyone in Quebec's maple world agreed. Independent producers and certain traders came to view the system as heavy-handed, monopolistic, a straitjacket dressed up as protection. Quotas limited how much they could officially sell, even in great seasons when their trees produced abundantly and they had syrup they couldn't legally move. Penalties for selling outside the system could be stiff: fines, lost quotas, exclusion from the regulated market entirely. Buyers who wanted to circumvent Federation prices faced pressure too. The message was clear: work within the system or face consequences. The result was a simmering undercurrent of resentment in some quarters. People began referring to the Federation not as a cooperative guardian but as a maple cartel. To them, it looked like a legally sanctioned monopoly that fixed prices and punished those who tried to operate on their own terms. And where resentment builds, opportunity follows. This tension gave rise to side dealers and gray market operators. People who knew how to move syrup outside official channels. They might buy from producers who quietly exceeded their quotas, paying cash, leaving no paper trail. Or they might sell to buyers willing to pay a bit less in exchange for avoiding Federation oversight and the premiums that came with it. These middlemen, sometimes known as barrel rollers, lived in the space between legality and defiance. They exploited the gap between the Federation's rules and the market's natural pressures. Their existence did not topple the Federation's control, not even close. But it revealed a parallel economy, one in which syrup could be treated not just as a regulated agricultural product but as contraband, documented only by trust and cash, not by official paperwork, not by inspections, not by rules. Within this polarized landscape, the strategic reserve took on an almost symbolic role. To the Federation and many producers, it represented collective security, proof that the industry could weather bad years and maintain orderly prices. It was a monument to cooperation, to long-term thinking, to the power of working together rather than competing to the bottom. To critics, though, it embodied something darker, the concentration of power. A massive, centralized stockpile that existed only because a single organization had the legal authority to dictate who could sell, when, and at what price. All that value, tens of millions of dollars of syrup, sitting in quiet warehouses, monitored by infrequent inspections and paperwork. It suggested both the Federation's confidence and its vulnerability. It was a system built on the assumption that no one would dare challenge it on a grand scale, that the sheer audacity of stealing thousands of barrels would be unthinkable, that the logistics alone would deter anyone foolish enough to try. As the 2012 inspection would reveal, that assumption turned out to be dangerously optimistic. The same features that made Quebec's maple system so dominant, its centralized control, its immense reserve, its reliance on a single powerful federation, also made it a unique target. The barrels in those warehouses were not just symbols of collective security. They were, in a very real sense, concentrated wealth in metal skins. For those who felt shut out or constrained by what they saw as the cartel, the sight of thousands of barrels sitting largely unattended for long stretches of time didn't inspire respect. It hinted at opportunity. The great maple syrup heist was born in that space between control and resentment, between a system that sought to manage a market and the people who saw in it something to defy and to exploit. Part 3: The Warehouse. The Reserve Warehouse near St. Louis de Blandford stood in the kind of quiet, rural landscape that did not invite suspicion. It was surrounded by fields and tree lines, open sky, the occasional farmhouse visible in the distance. The roads that reached it were modest, more accustomed to farm trucks hauling equipment and local traffic moving slowly through the countryside than to police cars or television crews. From the outside, it looked like many other agricultural or light industrial buildings scattered across rural Quebec. A large, utilitarian structure with metal siding, broad doors for loading, and no obvious signs that it housed a fortune. No armed guards stood at the entrance. No cameras watched from the corners. No razor wire topped the fence line. It was anonymous by design. Only those inside Quebec's maple system knew that behind its walls sat thousands of barrels belonging to the province's strategic reserve. To everyone else passing by, it was just another warehouse. Unremarkable, forgettable. And that was exactly the problem. Inside, the warehouse had a simple, functional design. The floor space was dominated by rows of white metal barrels, each one standard in size and shape. They were stacked in tiers, sometimes 3 or more high, creating long corridors of steel and that persistent sweet scent that seemed to hang in the air no matter how well the barrels were sealed. The barrels themselves were not individually emblazoned with brands or markings that would draw attention. They were anonymous units in a vast inventory, industrial, impersonal. One looked exactly like the next, which looked exactly like the 1,000 after that. Overhead, the ceiling stretched high and utilitarian. Industrial lighting cast a flat, even glow across the space. The building had the feel of a typical storage depot. Functional, efficient, but entirely ordinary. Not a vault. Not a treasury. Just storage. The building's purpose was to hold volume efficiently. Not to impress anyone with security features. Security practices reflected that mindset. The warehouse was not a high-security facility with round-the-clock guards and sophisticated surveillance. There were no motion sensors. No alarm systems. No checkpoint procedures. Access was controlled by keys, locks, and agreements. The kind of basic security you'd find at any commercial storage facility. Those who entered often did so as part of routine business tied to the Federation's operations. Inspectors, warehouse staff, contractors with leases or agreements. The system relied heavily on trust and on the assumption that people granted access were aligned with the Federation's goals. That they had the industry's best interests at heart. That they understood the responsibility. That they wouldn't betray that trust. Inspections focused on reconciling paperwork, counting barrels, and conducting periodic spot checks. But they did not physically verify the contents of every single drum on a regular basis. That would have been impractical. The sheer labor involved, opening thousands of barrels, testing contents, resealing them, would have consumed enormous time and resources. The inventory system did keep track of how many barrels were supposed to be in the warehouse and what grades and volumes the Federation had stored there. Numbers were logged. Records were maintained. Everything looked correct on paper. But paper is not reality. And the gap between the two can be exploited. The sheer number of barrels made close, frequent checks impractical. Detailed inspections were typically done on a limited basis. Often annually, sometimes less frequently depending on the facility and schedule. Routine oversight leaned on the idea that the numbers on paper matched reality on the floor, and that any discrepancies would be small. Easily spotted. Quickly explained. That approach worked perfectly well, as long as no one tried to systematically undermine it. As long as everyone played by the rules. As long as trust held. In practice, this created an environment uniquely suited to long-term theft. Think about it from a thief's perspective. The barrels all looked the same, whether full, half-empty, or filled with water. From a distance, and even up close if not physically handled, they formed a uniform landscape. Identical white drums stretching in every direction. A full barrel of syrup was extremely heavy. 600 pounds of dense liquid. But when stacked in tight columns rising toward the ceiling, the difference between a solid base and one that had been quietly emptied was not always obvious. Not until someone stepped on it. Not until someone tried to move it. As long as the stacks remained undisturbed, an empty or diluted barrel could hide in plain sight among thousands. Camouflaged by sheer volume. Protected by routine. The inspection schedule further widened the thieves' window. Detailed physical checks that involved opening or weighing barrels were done infrequently, often annually, because the reserve was designed as long-term storage. Some barrels might sit untouched for months, even years, waiting for the market to need them. That meant months could pass between the time a barrel entered the warehouse and the time anyone might seriously question its contents. For conspirators with access and patience, and above all time, this was an extraordinary opportunity. Syrup could be siphoned out in the dead of night. Barrels could be swapped during off hours. Water could be added to mask the weight loss. And as long as the total number of drums and their outward appearance matched the records, the system would not immediately raise an alarm. The theft could continue week after week, month after month, hidden beneath the surface of normalcy. The warehouse's rural isolation, too, played a role. Truck traffic in and out of such a facility did not automatically look suspicious. Agricultural regions are used to seeing tankers, flatbeds, and box trucks moving goods, loading, unloading, transporting equipment or supplies. It's part of the rhythm of rural life. Nighttime or off-season activity might not draw the same scrutiny it would in an urban industrial park, where security is tighter and neighbors notice unusual patterns. Out here in the quiet countryside, A truck arriving after dark or during a weekend could easily be explained away as routine maintenance, scheduled pickups, or ordinary agricultural business. With no constant security presence scrutinizing every movement, those who knew the rhythms of the place could choose their moments carefully. They could use ordinary-looking operations as cover for extraordinary thefts. They could blend in. All of these factors combined to create a paradox. The warehouse stored a commodity worth millions, tens of millions in fact. Yet it was built and operated like a conventional agricultural depot. Not like a treasury, not like a bank vault, not like anything that required serious protection. Its very normality was its weakness. The design and procedures were optimized for efficient storage and administrative control, for managing inventory on paper, for holding large volumes at low cost. They were not designed to defend against a patient, organized group willing to move thousands of barrels worth of syrup out the door over many months. No one had imagined that level of audacity. No one had planned for that scenario. And that blind spot, that gap between what the system was designed to prevent and what someone might actually attempt, became the key to everything that followed. The great maple syrup heist exploited that gap with surgical precision. It turned a place meant to safeguard the industry's future into the ideal setting for one of its most audacious crimes. The warehouse that was supposed to represent stability and collective security became, instead, a vault left wide open. All it needed was someone bold enough to walk through the door. Someone patient enough to work slowly. Someone connected enough to make the syrup disappear. And as it turned out, all three of those people existed. Part 4: The Conspirators. Discontent with Quebec's tightly managed maple syrup system did not appear overnight. For years, small and medium-sized producers had chafed under the Federation's quotas, inspections, and enforcement actions. They felt that a crop drawn from their own trees they had tapped, sap they had collected, syrup they had boiled, was effectively being taken out of their hands and placed under the authority of an institution they could not fully control. It was deeply personal. Some who exceeded their quotas secretly sold surplus syrup through unofficial channels, risking fines and penalties just to move product they believed was rightfully theirs. Others refused on principle to submit to what they saw as an unfair monopoly, paying steep fines and facing seizures rather than fall into line. The resentment was real, and it was widespread. In that climate, a parallel culture developed. A gray market where syrup moved off the books, brokered by middlemen who knew how to navigate the cracks between legality and defiance. These traders operated in the shadows, buying from producers who wanted better prices or more freedom than the Federation allowed, then selling to buyers willing to ignore official channels if it meant cheaper or more flexible supply. They were sometimes derided by Federation loyalists as troublemakers, criminals, thieves undermining the collective good. But to frustrated producers, they were something else entirely. They were a lifeline. Proof that the Federation's grip was not absolute. Proof that there were other ways to do business. Among the figures in this shadow economy was a man later identified in court proceedings as one of the great maple syrup heist's central conspirators. His name was Richard Vallières. He was known in the industry as someone who moved barrels outside the Federation's system, a barrel roller who understood both the legitimate and illegitimate sides of the syrup trade. Vallières was not a farmer. He did not tap trees or boil sap. He was a broker, a middleman, someone who dealt in volume and knew how to place syrup with buyers beyond Quebec's borders, especially in neighboring provinces and the northeastern United States, where the Federation's authority did not reach as far. To those who worked with him, Vallières was pragmatic, efficient, and discreet. He knew the market. He knew the players. He knew how to move product quietly and turn it into cash without drawing unwanted attention. To the Federation, he was exactly the kind of operator they were trying to eliminate. The idea of targeting the strategic reserve did not arise in a vacuum. To critics of the system, the reserve symbolized everything they disliked: a centralized hoard of syrup, accumulated and held back from the market under the Federation's control. All that value, tens of millions of dollars, sitting in warehouses, guarded by nothing more than paperwork and trust. The knowledge that tens of thousands of barrels sat there, inspected only periodically, created a dangerous temptation. Not just for producers who felt excluded or constrained, but for middlemen who understood just how valuable those barrels were as a bulk commodity. For conspirators like Vallières and those who would eventually join him, the reserve looked not just like policy. It looked like opportunity. But opportunity alone was not enough. Access was the first problem to solve. The reserve warehouse in St. Louis de Blandford was not open to just anyone. But as we've established, it was not a fortress either. The conspirators needed someone familiar with the facility and its operations, someone who could help secure legitimate-looking footholds, leases, permissions, arrangements that provided regular, unsuspicious entry. This insider presence was critical. It meant trucks and workers could come and go without automatically triggering alarm, especially if their movements fit within the normal patterns of loading, unloading, or maintenance. Deliveries, pickups, routine business. The conspirators did not need to break in. They needed only to blend in. And they did. Once access was assured, the plan evolved from idle talk into logistics. Real logistics. The kind that required careful thought and coordination. The group had to solve a series of practical questions. How do you remove syrup without immediate detection? Where do you store thousands of gallons once you've taken it? And most importantly, how do you transform stolen syrup into cash without getting caught? They settled on a method that took advantage of the warehouse's design and inspection rhythm. Instead of a dramatic one-night theft, a smash and grab that would immediately sound alarms, they would siphon syrup gradually from barrels over time. Sometimes they would swap full barrels for empties they controlled. Sometimes they would drain a barrel partially and then fill it with water to preserve the apparent volume and rough weight. This slow approach required patience, discipline, restraint, but it dramatically reduced the risk of sudden discovery before the next full inventory. Time was their greatest asset, and they intended to use every bit of it. For that, they needed equipment. Pumps and hoses allowed syrup to be transferred from Federation-owned barrels into transport containers. Other barrels, tanks, or industrial totes they controlled. The syrup moved slowly, thick and resistant, but the pumps were patient. 20 minutes per barrel. Sometimes longer if the syrup was particularly cold or dense. Forklifts or pallet jacks moved barrels around to create working space, rearranging stacks to hide gaps or access specific targets. And trucks, box trucks, flatbeds, tankers, became the arteries of the operation, carrying the stolen syrup away to secondary storage sites scattered across the region. In rural Quebec, truck traffic to and from a syrup warehouse did not attract immediate suspicion. Agriculture is a trucking business. Loads could be moved at times when activity would not look entirely out of place. Late evenings, weekends, off-season months, wrapped in the mundane appearance of ordinary business. Who would question another truck at a maple syrup warehouse? The operation required a chain of trust among the conspirators. At the base were those physically present in the warehouse, handling barrels, operating pumps, doing the manual labor of the theft itself. These were the people who got their hands dirty, who spent long hours in that cool, dim space, listening for any sound that might signal they'd been discovered. Above them were coordinators who arranged trucking schedules and storage locations, ensuring that the stolen syrup did not accumulate in one obvious place. They managed logistics. They solved problems. They kept everything moving smoothly. At the top were brokers like Vallières, who connected this illicit supply with buyers in other regions. They disguised its origin by mixing stolen syrup with legitimately sourced product, blending it into existing supply chains where questions wouldn't be asked. Then they sold it into markets where the Federation's reach was weaker. New Brunswick, Vermont, New York. Places where Quebec syrup was common enough that a few extra barrels wouldn't raise eyebrows. It was a sophisticated operation. And it worked. As the months passed, the original concept, a risky but finite siphoning, grew more ambitious. Each successful transfer without consequences reinforced the belief that the plan could continue. The conspirators saw that inspections were not catching their activities in real time. That paperwork still reflected the expected number of barrels in the warehouse. That no one was rushing to weigh or open them en masse. The system was blind. And they knew it. Confidence bred escalation. More barrels were targeted, more trips organized, more buyers engaged. The scope expanded from hundreds of barrels to thousands. From a daring theft to something approaching industrial-scale smuggling. What had begun as an exploitation of a security gap gradually turned into one of the largest commodity thefts in Canadian history. Powered by the same dissatisfaction and underground networks that had long simmered beneath Quebec's Maple Cartel. Powered by resentment turned into action. And powered above all by the belief that they could get away with it. For a long time they were right. Part 5, The Heist. The theft of Quebec's strategic reserve did not unfold in a single daring night. There was no dramatic break-in. No alarm systems disabled. No guards overpowered. Instead, it was a slow bleed spread over many months. An operation designed to hide inside the rhythms of ordinary warehouse activity. Invisible by design. Patient by necessity. The conspirators turned the St. Louis de Blandford site into a kind of covert refinery. A place where barrels arrived full and, bit by bit, were transformed into hollow shells that still looked from the outside like part of a secure stockpile. Inside the warehouse, the first step was always the same. Choose which barrels to tap. The conspirators targeted Federation-owned drums stacked among thousands of others. They worked carefully, using forklifts to pull specific barrels into workable positions where pumps and hoses could reach without drawing attention. The stacks had to be rearranged, gaps filled, the appearance of order maintained. Using portable equipment, industrial pumps, heavy-duty hoses, they siphoned the dense maple syrup out of the barrels. It flowed slowly, thick and resistant, into containers they controlled. Other barrels, plastic tanks, large industrial totes that could be easily loaded onto trucks. The work was physical, time-consuming, sometimes messy, but it followed a clear logic. Remove as much syrup as possible while leaving behind something that would not immediately draw attention. To keep appearances intact, they employed two main tricks. In some cases, they simply removed a full barrel and replaced it with an empty one they'd brought in. This preserved the overall count and visual layout of the warehouse. From a distance, nothing looked disturbed. The stacks remained uniform. The rows stayed complete. In other cases, they drew off syrup and then refilled the original barrel with water. Carefully measured to match the weight closely enough that a casual shove or a quick visual inspection would not betray the change. Water and syrup do not behave the same way. Water sloshed more freely. It moved differently when the barrel was tilted. But as long as no one opened the lid or weighed the barrel precisely, the substitution could pass unnoticed. From the Federation's perspective, the tall stacks of white drums still appeared uniform and complete. Everything looked normal. And that was the entire point. Once siphoned, the stolen syrup had to move. This was where the operation became most vulnerable. Moving thousands of gallons required trucks, multiple trips, coordination. Any one of these movements could have been spotted, questioned, investigated. But trucks became the lifeline of the operation. Ordinary-looking vehicles that could back up to warehouse doors, take on loads of filled containers, and roll away along rural roads that were accustomed to agricultural traffic. The conspirators did not try to hide every movement. They couldn't. Instead, they relied on something far more effective. The assumption that trucks at a syrup warehouse were unremarkable. Who would question it? Box trucks came and went. Flatbeds carried loads. Tankers rolled through at odd hours. To anyone watching, if anyone was watching, it looked like routine business. Maintenance, transfers, normal operations. Loads were taken to remote storage sites under the conspirators' control, where the syrup could be consolidated, repackaged, and prepared for sale. Hidden barns. Industrial spaces leased under other names. Places where questions wouldn't be asked. From there, it began to flow outward. Into other provinces. New Brunswick, Ontario. Across the border into the northeastern United States. Vermont, New York, New Hampshire. Mixed with legitimate supplies until its origin became almost impossible to trace. Once blended into existing supply chains, once it had changed hands 2 or 3 times, the stolen syrup simply disappeared into the market. Indistinguishable, anonymous, gone. The operation's power lay in its patience. Rather than emptying the warehouse in one shocking sweep, which would have triggered immediate alarms, the conspirators chipped away at the reserve over time. They returned again and again, week after week, month after month. Each visit removed only a fraction of the total inventory. A few dozen barrels here, a few dozen there. But over many months, the cumulative effect was enormous. The numbers kept adding up. The gaps kept growing. And no one noticed. The Federation's inspection schedule, focused on annual or periodic inventories, gave them all the room they needed to maneuver. As long as paperwork matched the number of barrels on the floor, and as long as no one conducted a comprehensive physical verification, actually opening barrels, actually weighing them, the loss remained invisible. The system was blind, and they exploited that blindness perfectly. Months passed. Seasons changed. The operation continued. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. And still the syrup flowed out. By the time the wobbling barrel in 2012 exposed the scheme, the damage was staggering. Investigators later estimated that approximately 9,571 barrels had been affected. Partially drained, swapped for empties or filled with water. That represented close to 3,000 metric tons of maple syrup. To put that in perspective, imagine 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled to the brim with syrup. That's how much they took. At prevailing prices, that volume was valued at around 18 to 19 million Canadian dollars. It made the heist not only extraordinary in its choice of commodity, maple syrup of all things, but one of the most lucrative thefts in Canadian history. What had looked like a stable wall of stored wealth had, in reality, been hollowed out layer by layer. Each siphoned barrel was a small victory that, taken together, nearly turned the strategic reserve into an empty shell. The fortress had been robbed from the inside. Slowly, methodically, patiently, and for a long time no one knew. Part 6. The Investigation. When the first barrels sloshed with water instead of syrup, the Federation's inspectors reacted as they always did to anomalies. By counting, checking, comparing what they saw on the warehouse floor to what existed in the books. What began as a targeted inquiry into a suspicious stack quickly grew into something far larger. Teams fanned out through the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse, working methodically down each row, opening barrels, weighing them, testing contents, marking those that seemed wrong. At first, they hoped the damage might be limited. A few compromised barrels, perhaps. An isolated act of tampering. Something explainable. Something containable. But each new sample chipped away at that hope. Here was another barrel filled with water. Wrong. There was one that was nearly empty, its steel shell ringing hollow when tapped, the sound echoing in the silence of the warehouse. Others contained syrup, but far less than they should. Their contents reduced by careful siphoning, leaving just enough behind to avoid immediate suspicion during a casual check. The more they tested, the clearer the pattern became. This was not accident. This was not mischief. This was systematic theft. The Federation alerted provincial authorities. Within hours, the warehouse was transformed. What had been a storage facility became a crime scene. Police tape went up. Investigators arrived with cameras and clipboards. The quiet rural building that had held Quebec's liquid gold now held something else entirely. Evidence of one of the most audacious thefts in Canadian history. Investigators documented everything. They photographed stacks of barrels from every angle. They mapped where compromised drums clustered, looking for patterns that might reveal how the thieves had moved through the building. Which sections were hit hardest? Which remained untouched? What did that tell them about access points and timing? Inventory records were pulled and scrutinized line by line, tracing when barrels had entered the reserve, from which producers and under what conditions. Cross-referencing dates with inspection schedules. Looking for gaps. Looking for opportunities. The numbers told a stark story. Nearly 9,571 barrels affected. Close to 3,000 metric tons of syrup missing. A loss valued around 18 to 19 million Canadian dollars. What the Federation had thought of as a secure buffer stock, the foundation of their entire system, now appeared riddled with gaps, hollowed out, compromised on a scale no one had imagined possible. From there, the investigation moved outward. Because syrup, unlike cash, cannot simply vanish into thin air. It has to be stored somewhere, transported somehow, sold to someone. 3,000 metric tons of maple syrup leaves a trail. Investigators began asking the obvious question: where could such a large volume have gone? They looked to the broader market, searching for unusual surpluses and suspiciously well-supplied dealers, who suddenly had access to large quantities of syrup they couldn't account for, who was selling at prices that seemed too good to be true. Leads pointed beyond Quebec's borders, into neighboring New Brunswick, where the Federation's authority was weaker, into the maple country of the northeastern United States, particularly parts of New England like Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York, where maple syrup was produced and traded but where Quebec's regulatory system had less direct influence. These were places where Quebec syrup could blend in, where questions might not be asked, where the stolen product could disappear into legitimate supply chains. In these regions, authorities and Federation representatives started knocking on doors. They questioned wholesalers and independent traders who suddenly seemed able to offer large quantities of syrup at attractive prices. Where did this come from? Who supplied it? Can you show us purchase records? Supplier names? Shipping details? Some buyers had accepted shipments with scant documentation, trusting long-standing relationships or the apparent legitimacy of the product. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Quebec syrup showing up in New England? That was normal. That happened all the time. Others grew nervous when questioned. Their stories didn't quite add up. Details were vague. Documentation was incomplete, or missing entirely. The more investigators pressed, the more the cracks showed. And those cracks only deepened suspicions. Patterns slowly emerged. Certain dealers in New Brunswick and New England appeared repeatedly in shipping logs and testimony. The same names, the same locations, linked to shipments that lined up suspiciously well with the period during which the reserve had been quietly drained. From these nodes, investigators worked backward. They traced transport routes, mapping the flow of syrup from Quebec to these distribution points. They interviewed drivers, men who remembered hauling loads from warehouses, though the details were sometimes fuzzy. They questioned warehouse staff who'd seen trucks come and go at odd hours. They pressed middlemen who operated in that gray space between legal and illegal trade. Each interview added another piece to a mosaic. Memories of trucks hauling syrup from Quebec under vague explanations that, in retrospect, didn't make sense. Recollections of deals that seemed unusually generous. Prices that were just slightly too low, quantities that were just slightly too large. Mentions of brokers who operated outside the system. Names that kept coming up. Connections that kept forming. Through this patient legwork, this tedious, methodical police work, names began to crystallize. Warehouse insiders who'd provided access, truckers who'd moved the loads, and at the center of it all, brokers who'd turned stolen syrup into cash. Phone records were subpoenaed. Financial transactions were tracked. Movement logs were analyzed. The digital trail, calls, texts, bank transfers, connected these individuals to both the reserve warehouse and the suspiciously abundant supplies showing up elsewhere. The network took shape. What had started with one light barrel in a quiet Quebec warehouse now stretched across provincial and international lines. It revealed a shadow network that had turned the Federation's strategic reserve into raw material for illicit trade. The conspirators had been patient, careful, organized, but they had left traces. And those traces led directly to them. The manhunt, grounded as much in accounting and logistics as in traditional detective work, had found its quarry. In the very channels that normally kept the maple world flowing, investigators had uncovered the architecture of the heist. The people, the routes, the methods. Now came the arrest. Part 7, the arrest. As investigators followed syrup and money across provincial lines and into the northeastern United States, what first looked like scattered anomalies began to resolve into a recognizable pattern. The picture was coming into focus. Dealers in New Brunswick and New England who had suddenly gained access to large quantities of Quebec-grade syrup all pointed, directly or indirectly, to the same small circle of intermediaries. People who seemed able to conjure up bulk shipments without the usual Federation paperwork, without the usual documentation, without the usual explanations. These weren't isolated incidents. They were all connected. On one side of the pattern were warehouse insiders. Individuals with legitimate ties to the St. Louis de Blandford Reserve who could arrange access, unlock doors, and move barrels around without drawing immediate suspicion. They were the foundation. The ones who opened the door and kept it open. Without them, nothing else would have been possible. On another side were transporters. Drivers and coordinators who scheduled trucks, loaded siphon syrup into tanks or barrels, and steered those loads to secondary storage sites and border-adjacent buyers. They were the arteries of the operation, moving product out of Quebec and into markets where questions wouldn't be asked. And linking them all together were brokers, the crucial connectors who understood both the gray market and the legitimate trade. People capable of folding stolen syrup into ordinary commercial flows so that it would blend into the background noise of regional supply. They were the translators, turning theft into profit, contraband into cash. Each role depended on the others. It was a machine, and every part had to work. As investigators cross-checked interview transcripts, shipping records, phone logs, and financial transfers, the same names recurred. Again and again. The same people. The same connections. Central among them was Richard Vallières. He was identified in court proceedings as a key architect and buyer of the stolen syrup. Someone who purchased product siphoned directly from the reserve and then resold it to wholesalers in other provinces and the United States. He was the linchpin, the one who made it all profitable, the one who knew how to move thousands of gallons without raising red flags. Around him clustered co-conspirators who allegedly handled logistics, associates who helped negotiate access to the warehouse, providing cover and legitimacy for activities that were anything but legitimate. Workers who physically siphoned the syrup and swapped barrels, spending long hours in that dim warehouse, pumping syrup barrel by barrel, replacing stolen product with water. Truckers who hauled contraband loads under the guise of routine commerce, driving through the night on rural roads, crossing provincial borders and international lines with paperwork that looked clean but told a completely false story. It was organized, methodical, professional, and now authorities had them. Once authorities were confident they had mapped the core of the network. Once they knew who was involved, what role each person played, and how the operation functioned, they moved to shut it down. Police executed coordinated operations across Quebec and beyond. Multiple locations, multiple arrests, multiple simultaneous raids designed to prevent anyone from destroying evidence or warning others. More than a dozen people were arrested and tied to different stages of the heist. Reports commonly cite around 16 to 17 individuals charged in connection with the theft. A sprawling network that touched warehouse workers, truckers, storage facility operators, and high-level brokers. Those closest to the warehouse faced accusations of direct involvement in siphoning and barrel manipulation, breaking and entering, theft over a certain value, conspiracy. Transporters were charged for moving stolen syrup, sometimes knowingly, sometimes claiming they didn't ask enough questions. Brokers and financiers were alleged to have orchestrated sales and profited from the proceeds, turning millions of dollars in stolen product into personal wealth. The arrests made clear that the Great Maple Syrup heist was not the work of a lone thief exploiting a momentary oversight. It was not opportunistic. It was not accidental. It was a coordinated criminal enterprise that spanned from the innermost aisles of the reserve warehouse to distant loading docks and broker offices across 2 countries. Each role, insider, handler, driver, dealer, was a link in a chain that had turned Quebec's strategic reserve into a source for one of the largest commodity thefts in the country's history, until the converging trails of syrup and money finally pulled that chain into the open. The warehouse that had seemed so secure was breached. The system that had seemed so stable was exploited. The people who had seemed trustworthy were, in fact, criminals. And now they would face the consequences. Part 8: The Trial. When the Great Maple Syrup heist finally reached court, The story of the wobbling barrel and the hollowed-out reserve had to be translated from warehouse shop into the language of law. Numbers, systems, intent. In packed courtrooms where journalists, producers, and curious onlookers filled the gallery, prosecutors walked judges and jurors through the peculiar world of Quebec's maple syrup regime. They explained how the Federation controlled quotas, prices, and bulk sales, how its strategic reserve, tens of thousands of barrels stored in rural warehouses, functioned as a buffer against bad harvests and market swings. For many in the courtroom, this was the first time they truly understood what maple syrup meant to Quebec. Not just a breakfast condiment, not just a regional specialty, but an industry, an economy, a way of life. Charts and ledgers replaced rows of barrels. Prosecutors highlighted that nearly 9,571 barrels had been affected, representing close to 3,000 tons of syrup worth roughly 18 to 19 million Canadian dollars at the time of the theft. They argued that this was not just syrup. It was a core asset of an entire provincial industry. It was the livelihood of thousands of producers. It was the foundation of a system designed to protect those producers from market volatility. And it had been stolen, systematically, deliberately, over many months. Witnesses took the stand one after another. They described siphoning methods, how pumps and hoses were used to drain barrels in the quiet hours. They explained barrel swaps, how full drums were replaced with empties to maintain the appearance of a complete inventory. They testified about the use of water to disguise losses, carefully measured and poured to approximate the weight of syrup. Investigators testified about tracking suspicious surpluses to dealers in New Brunswick and the northeastern United States. About interviewing buyers who suddenly had access to quantities they couldn't explain. About following the money and the syrup as they flowed across provincial lines and international borders. The courtroom narrative tied these details together into a picture of an organized scheme that reached from the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse to buyers far beyond Quebec. It was thorough, methodical, damning. At the center of the proceedings stood the defendants, cast as key players in that scheme. Chief among them was Richard Vallières. Evidence presented against him was substantial. Testimony indicated he bought large quantities of syrup he knew came from the reserve, stolen property, and then resold it for profit. Records showed the scale of his transactions, the network of buyers he worked with, the millions of dollars that passed through his hands. Vallières did not deny that he dealt in syrup outside the Federation's system. In court, he portrayed himself at times as a businessman operating in a long-standing gray market. He argued that he was simply meeting market demand, that he was providing a service to producers who felt constrained by the Federation's rules, that the extent of his responsibility and his gains had been exaggerated. He positioned himself as a middleman, not a mastermind. Prosecutors, however, framed him differently. They called him a ringleader, a man who gave the theft its economic purpose by turning stolen syrup into cash. Without him, they argued, the operation would have had no point. The syrup could be siphoned, sure. It could be moved. But it needed someone who could sell it. Someone who understood the market, who had the connections, who could make millions of dollars in stolen product disappear into legitimate supply chains. That person was Vallières. Alongside him sat co-defendants accused of roles ranging from arranging warehouse access and handling barrels to driving loads and facilitating sales. Some had already cooperated with authorities, admitting limited involvement and hoping for leniency. They testified against others. They provided details. They tried to minimize their own culpability. Others contested the charges, insisting they were minor participants or unaware of the syrup's true origin. They claimed ignorance. They pointed fingers elsewhere. They argued they were simply doing their jobs, driving trucks, moving barrels, without asking too many questions. The courtroom became a place where loyalties fractured and self-preservation took over. Verdicts reflected the court's view of a structured criminal enterprise. Richard Vallières was convicted on charges including fraud and trafficking in stolen goods. He received a multi-year prison sentence, reported as several years behind bars, along with a massive fine calibrated to his illegal profits. courts ordered him to pay many millions of dollars, often cited in the range of 9 million Canadian dollars or more, under provisions that allow the state to recover proceeds of crime. If he failed to pay, additional prison time could be imposed. The message was clear: profit from crime and the state will take it back, every dollar. Other convicted conspirators received a mix of penalties, depending on their involvement and cooperation. Warehouse insiders who facilitated access or helped siphon barrels received prison sentences, some measured in years, others in months. Transporters who moved loads faced their own charges and fines. Intermediaries who passed syrup along the chain were sentenced to conditional terms or probation, their roles deemed less central but still criminal. None faced penalties on the scale reserved for the principal organizers, people like Vallières who had orchestrated and profited most directly. But everyone involved paid a price. Taken together, the sentences signaled a clear message. Even if the commodity was maple syrup rather than cash or gold, the law viewed the Great Maple Syrup Heist as a major economic crime that struck at the heart of a regulated industry. The theft had undermined the Federation's authority. It had violated the trust of thousands of producers. It had destabilized a system designed to protect Quebec's most iconic agricultural product. And those who profited from it would be punished accordingly. The courtroom doors closed. The sentences were handed down. And the story moved from the realm of law enforcement into the realm of legend. Part 9: The Aftermath. In the years after the Great Maple Syrup Heist, the physical losses were only part of the damage. Investigations, seizures, and court orders eventually clawed back a significant portion of the stolen product. Estimates often put the recovered amount at roughly 2/3 of the volume taken. Thousands of barrels, millions of dollars in value, returned to the Federation's control. But a large remainder had already vanished, blended into legitimate stocks, sold on to unsuspecting buyers, consumed by people who had no idea their pancakes were being topped with stolen syrup. Gone forever. What could not be recovered in barrels or dollars was something more intangible but perhaps more damaging. The blow to the Federation's reputation. The very body that claimed to safeguard Quebec's syrup supply, the organization built on collective security and careful management, had allowed tens of millions of dollars in product to be siphoned away inside its own reserve system. Under its watch. Behind doors it controlled. In warehouses it was supposed to be monitoring. The irony was not lost on critics. The same Federation that enforced strict quotas and penalties on producers had failed to protect the very reserve that justified those rules. For the Fédération de producteurs acéricoles du Québec, the heist became a catalyst for internal reckoning. The image of a strategic reserve treated almost like a bank of liquid gold no longer matched the reality of lax, trust-based practices in rural warehouses. That disconnect between what the reserve represented and how it was actually protected could not be ignored. In response, the Federation moved to tighten security and governance. Systematically, deliberately, learning from failure, they introduced more frequent and systematic inspections, ensuring that barrels would not sit unchecked for months at a time. Where once an annual inventory might have been considered sufficient, now spot checks became routine. Random audits, surprise visits, physical verification of contents, not just counting drums from a distance. Inventory controls were upgraded with closer tracking of individual lots. Each barrel was logged more carefully, when it entered the reserve, where it came from, what grade it contained, how long it had been stored. Better reconciliation between physical counts and records meant discrepancies would be caught faster. Procedures were put in place that made it harder for empty or watered-down barrels to hide among thousands of others. The days of trust-based accounting were over. Access to reserve facilities also came under scrutiny. Where the old system had relied heavily on keys, informal familiarity, and basic contracts, the post-heist regime emphasized something different: verification. Stricter vetting of who could enter the warehouses. Background checks. clearer separation of duties so that no single person had unchecked access and control. More formal oversight of anyone with direct contact with the barrels. Logs had to be maintained. Movements had to be documented. Questions had to be asked. Physical security measures were strengthened too, ranging from improved locks and alarm systems to greater monitoring of vehicle movements. Cameras were installed. Gates were reinforced. Security personnel, once considered unnecessary, became part of the landscape. Trucks could no longer quietly shuttle away large volumes without leaving a more obvious trail. Every vehicle entering or leaving was now tracked, weighed, recorded. The logistics that had once made the heist possible were now under constant surveillance. These changes went beyond hardware and paperwork. They altered the culture around the reserve. Within the industry, the heist became a cautionary tale. A story told and retold at meetings and conferences. About the risks of concentrating value without matching vigilance. About the dangers of assuming that internal trust and legal authority were sufficient protection against organized theft. About what happens when you believe your system is too important, too respected, too essential to be targeted. For many producers, the Federation's reforms were both reassurance and reminder. Reassurance that lessons had been learned, that the organization had taken the crisis seriously, that the strategic reserve would not be compromised again in the same way, but also a reminder, a sobering one, that even a system designed to stabilize and protect can become vulnerable if it fails to see itself as a potential target. The heist had exposed more than security gaps. It had exposed a mindset, an assumption, a belief that the rules and the reputation would be enough. They weren't. The strategic reserve survived. It still exists today, holding tens of thousands of barrels across Quebec. Still functioning as a buffer against bad harvests and market volatility. Still central to the province's maple syrup economy. But it emerged from the heist fundamentally changed. More guarded. More closely watched. Far less likely to assume that its barrels were safe simply because they were stacked behind familiar doors. The wobbling barrel that started it all had taught Quebec an expensive lesson. And the Federation would not forget it. Part 10: The Legend. Long after the last trial ended, the great maple syrup heist refused to fade into obscurity. Reporters, documentarians, and podcast hosts seized on the unlikely combination of elements. Rural warehouses, white barrels, and an $18 million theft of a breakfast staple. They turned it into a story that could headline magazines, streaming episodes, and true crime series around the world. The contrast between the apparent absurdity, maple syrup as contraband, and the very real financial stakes made it irresistible. Here was a case where headlines could be funny, but the underlying crime was as serious as any major commodity theft, where you could smile at the premise while being genuinely shocked by the scale. It was perfect storytelling material. Long-form articles dissected the Federation's structure and the mechanics of the heist, walking readers through quota systems, strategic reserves, and the vulnerabilities that made it all possible. Documentaries and podcasts leaned into character and atmosphere. The lonely warehouse surrounded by fields. The wobbling barrel that exposed everything. The brokers who treated syrup like liquid gold. Moving barrels through the shadows of a gray market most people didn't know existed. Dramatizations and scripted series drew on public records and reporting to build narrative arcs around disgruntled producers who felt strangled by quotas, gray market traders who saw opportunity in resentment, and the investigators who followed syrup trails across provincial borders into New Brunswick and New England. The story was amplified for audiences far beyond Canada. People who had never thought about maple syrup as anything more than something you poured on pancakes. The heist became part of a broader pop culture fascination with unlikely criminal enterprises. mentioned alongside capers involving stolen cheese in Italy, pilfered nuts in California, or vanished seafood in Spain. Crimes where the commodity itself seemed almost comedic, yet the operations were sophisticated and the losses real. But the maple syrup heist was almost always singled out. The most Canadian crime imaginable. The one that seemed to perfectly capture something about the country. Polite, absurd, yet completely serious underneath. At the same time, the case found a second life in policy discussions and academic commentary. Beyond the entertainment value, there was substance here. Questions worth asking. Analysts pointed to Quebec's Maple Federation as an example of a highly regulated, quota-based system that functioned, in some respects, like a legal cartel. It stabilized prices. It controlled supply. It protected producers from market volatility. But it also created powerful incentives for black market workarounds. The heist became a case study, used in business schools, law classes, and policy seminars, about how concentrating vast value in a strategic reserve turns warehouses into tempting targets for organized crime when security and oversight do not match the stakes. Whether the commodity is maple syrup, precious metals, or fossil fuels, the principle remains the same. Concentrate value and someone will come for it. Critics of the Federation use the story to argue that heavy-handed control can push some actors into the shadows, where resentment and opportunity mix into a willingness to break the rules. If you squeeze people hard enough, they'll find ways around you. If you make legitimate business difficult enough, you create a black market. If you concentrate power in one institution, you create targets for those who feel excluded. Others countered that the crime showed the need for stronger, not weaker, collective institutions. If the reserve was going to function like a bank for producers, if it was going to hold hundreds of millions of dollars in value, then it needed the governance and physical protection of a financial institution, not a lightly monitored farm depot. The theft wasn't an argument against the system. It was an argument for taking the system seriously. In that debate, maple syrup stood in for a broader set of questions. How do we manage agricultural markets? How do we prevent cartel-like behavior while still protecting small producers? How do we anticipate the criminal logic that follows any concentrated high-value stockpile? The wobbling barrel in St. Louis de Blandford had opened a conversation that reached far beyond Quebec. Today, references to the Great Maple Syrup Heist surface in discussions of everything from food supply security to the economics of cartels. In lectures about unconventional crime. In books about organized theft. In articles about supply chain vulnerabilities. The story endures because it illustrates a simple, unsettling lesson, one that applies to far more than maple syrup. Whenever a system turns a commonplace product into tightly controlled, highly valuable inventory, whether stored in barrels, silos, or data centers, someone somewhere will start thinking like the thieves at St. Louis de Blandford, looking for the gaps, measuring the risks, calculating whether the reward is worth it. And sometimes, if the conditions are right, they'll act. The Great Maple Syrup Heist reminds us that value doesn't require gold bars or cryptocurrency. It doesn't require high-tech vaults or armed guards. Sometimes all it takes is a warehouse full of white barrels, a system built on trust, and people patient enough to drain it slowly. Part 11. The Warehouse Today. Years after the heist, the warehouse near St. Louis de Blandford no longer feels like an ordinary rural depot. The metal shell is the same. The fields around it still change with the seasons. Green in summer, gold in autumn, white in winter. And white barrels still stand in long, ordered rows inside, stacked toward the ceiling just as they always were. But something fundamental has changed. Where once the reserve relied on familiarity and habit, on the assumption that these barrels were safe simply because they belonged to the Federation, it now rests under sharper eyes and tighter locks. There is a more formal awareness now. An understanding that what sits inside is not just an agricultural product, but concentrated wealth that others have already proven willing to steal. The memory of the inspector nearly losing his footing on a suspiciously light barrel lingers as a quiet warning. A reminder that trust without verification can tip at any moment into catastrophe. Within Quebec's maple industry, the great maple syrup heist permanently altered how security and trust are understood. The Federation's strategic reserve was once treated almost as a given, a background fact that producers and buyers could rely on without thinking much about the practicalities of guarding tens of thousands of barrels. It was just there, stable, reliable, protected by reputation and regulation. After the heist, it became clear that a system powerful enough to set prices and stockpile product must also behave like a true custodian, with controls, with audits, with the kind of skepticism appropriate to the value it holds. Producers who had assumed their syrup was safe once it entered the reserve now know that vigilance does not end at the warehouse door. It must be built into how that warehouse is managed, monitored, and protected every single day. Trust is not enough. It never was. The broader lesson reaches far beyond maple trees in rural Quebec. Any highly regulated, high-value commodity can be transformed into liquid gold by the very systems designed to protect and ration it. Grain under a board's control, fuel in national stockpiles, rare metals held to stabilize markets, even data stored in server farms. The more an institution concentrates value and limits access, the more appealing that concentration becomes to those willing to step outside the rules, especially if physical security and oversight lag behind economic significance. The Great Maple Syrup Heist exposed that gap in vivid, almost cinematic form. It showed how a product associated with comfort and tradition, something as homely and familiar as maple syrup, could become the centerpiece of a meticulous multi-million-dollar crime. It proved that value doesn't care about context. It doesn't care if the commodity seems absurd or unlikely. Value attracts attention, always. And where there is concentrated value without adequate protection, there will eventually be theft. In the end, the barrels in Quebec's reserves still stand. But they no longer rest solely on trust. They are weighed, watched with an understanding earned the hard way, that even the most homely commodity, once pooled, standardized, and tightly controlled, lives under the same shadow as any other treasure. Systems built on trust alone must eventually harden. Not because trust has no place. Trust is essential. Trust is what makes communities and institutions function. But trust without robust defenses is an invitation to ingenuity, to opportunism, and, as the maple world discovered, to theft on a scale no one had thought to imagine until it was already too late. Somewhere in Quebec today, an inspector walks through a warehouse. He checks marks. He counts barrels. He reconciles paperwork with physical inventory. And when he climbs a stack to reach a higher row, he tests each barrel carefully before putting his weight on it. Pushing down, feeling the resistance, making sure it doesn't shift, making sure it's real. Because he knows, they all know now, that trust is not measured in policies or regulations or good intentions. It's measured in the weight of a barrel, in the vigilance of those who watch over it, and in the willingness to question what should have been questioned all along. The Great Maple Syrup Heist is over, but the lesson it taught remains. In every warehouse, in every stockpile, in every system that concentrates value and assumes it will be safe, the wobbling barrel is still there, not as a physical object but as a memory, a warning, a reminder that even the most solid foundations can turn hollow when no one thinks to check. Thank you for listening.